Can everyone see the slides? Great, okay. So I'm just going to jump into the talk then. My land acknowledgement was, I was trying to conclude by saying that these kinds of acknowledgements can be empty and performative gestures when they're not tied to the kinds of initiatives that I'm going to describe today, and to the relationship building that goes to the core of what we do as scholars of Latin America, even and maybe especially when we work outside of the geographically determined ideas of Latin America and when we apply our training in our own communities. The historiography of colonial Latin America has an origins problem, in that after 500 years, we are still struggling to tell the story of Columbus's landing and what it meant and continues to mean for the history of the region. The story that we learn in school is that Columbus, looking for Asia, makes landfall in the Caribbean in October of 1492, and thereafter the native population of the Antilles collapses almost immediately. Because of the decimation of indigenous peoples, the Spanish crown invests in the African slave trade, never directly, but rather through a series of monopoly contracts that at first favor well-connected individuals and by the 17th century can only be fulfilled by large enterprises. This then is the birth of modern global capitalism, the extraction of precious metals in the Americas, mined and refined by coerced and enslaved indigenous and then African women and men, which is underwritten by demand for silver in East Asia and gold in Europe. Iberian merchants bring New World silver to China and Japan, exchange it for gold at a rate of almost 2 to 1, and then sell the gold in Europe, trading and trafficking in human beings and goods throughout the Indian Ocean world on their return home. Ships unloaded gold in Europe and others purchased African slaves to begin the worldwide circulation anew. There's a lot about this story that's true, such as profits from bimetallic trades in China, slave raids in West and Central West Africa, and the central role of New World wealth in linking Asia, Africa, and Europe into global modes of exchange. But what if we've gotten some parts of the story wrong, especially the part about indigenous collapse? How can a new approach to colonial archives help us to tell about the past? And I want to be clear that native populations in the Caribbean did decline, and precipitously so, but they didn't disappear, which I'll show with an analysis of the techniques and technologies of gold mining in La Española, the Dominican Republic, in the mid-1520s, nearly 30 years after Columbus's landing. Historians once spoke of Taínos, the indigenous people of the island, as a vanished people. That's a direct quote from a book published in 2008. This assessment is based on demographic estimates culled from colonial sources like parish records, ecological analyses of carrying capacities, and archaeological interpretations of objects that were recovered from public plazas. What it's not based on, as archaeologist Kathleen Deegan pointed out in 1992, is household unit analysis. This is a critical omission in a matrilineal society. By examining the ordinary objects of everyday life, Deegan found far greater patterns of continuity in Taíno society than the macro narrative of collapse had suggested. Taínos did not just collapse upon the arrival of Africans and Europeans. They followed time-honored practices of intermarriage, village shifting, and regrouping, and therein formed new families with Africans, Spaniards, and the thousands of other native peoples of the Caribbean who were trafficked throughout the region and into gold mining districts, including Calinagos, Lucayos, Arawaks, Mayas, and people relocated from present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. Archaeological evidence is a critical source for scholars to use in the documentation of Taíno life under Spanish colonial rule. But so is language. Even though only 6 complete sentences of Taíno and a handful of 2- and 3-word phrases are known to us today. Using this highly fragmented language data, much of which concerns gold mining, historians, linguists, and literary scholars who bridge those fields can make an important contribution to the study of Taíno continuity. Here's what I mean. In 1525, Pedro López de Mesa, a resident of Concepción de la Vega, a mining town located in the heart of what is now the Dominican Republic, traveled to Spain to petition the crown to alter the season of gold refining in La Vega. For the past 3 years, their refinery, one of only 2 facilities on the island, highlighted here on the map, had processed gold in November and December. But, he said, if the crown would instead let them refine gold in June, miners could harvest another crop, caña fístula, a fragrant yellow leaf tree with medicinal properties. López de Mesa presented his ideas in a 27-point proposal. Most of these points were dismissed by council members who doodled alongside passages or marked them as no puede ser. But they were so taken with the idea to move the season of gold refining from November to June that they highlighted 13 lines of the paragraph and glossed main ideas in the margins. On October 13th, 1525, the policy was formally enacted into law. At first blush, this might not seem like a big deal, but the change was potentially quite disruptive to Spanish goals, and therefore it's worth a deeper consideration. For one, refiners would now be melting metals in over open flames in thatch roof huts called bohíos, whose circular design might reflect Taino visions of a concentric universe. And they would do so during the start of the hurricane season. These are not optimal conditions to maximize gold production. Second, it would remove one of the key incentives to recruit Spanish crews to the colony. As Jael Sued Badillo has shown by cross-referencing passenger logs and refinery statements, ship captains coordinated arrivals in Santo Domingo with the gold work season so that sailors would have an immediate source of income. Caña fístula, the medicinal plant that López de Mesa suggests could replace gold as a source of income, generated no more than 4 ducados per quintal, per 100 pounds, or about 1,500 maravedís, according to natural historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's account of 1535. In contrast, in 1520, a bust year in the island's cycle of gold booms and busts, the colony sent 5,000 pesos worth of gold, or more than 1.5 million maravedís, to Spain. So while it was true that the crown would have been interested in pursuing alternative industries, it's hard to believe that anyone who wanted to maximize the production of gold and the extraction of colonial wealth would have come up with the idea to change the season of refining. The fact that this idea seems almost prejudicial to Spanish imperial economic goals provides the first clue of Taino influence. According to a creation story shared by Tainos with Catalan priest Ramon Panay around 1498, in the Macorís region of La Española, about 40 kilometers away from the gold mining districts of La Vega, the Taino world came into being in 2 distinct stages. The first people emerged from a cave called Casibahagua, meaning hole and hagua tree, an important source of black dye used in body painting. The cave was nestled within the mountains of Cauta in the central province of Caunao, whose name means place of gold. One day, some of these first people went outside to fish, and when they returned, the entrance to the cave had been sealed shut, and the man charged with guarding the door, Mako Kael, or man without eyelids, is said to have been carried off by the sun. The door immediately turned to stone, and the sun transformed the fishermen into green hobo trees that bear yellow fruit, ripe. Although the people inside the cave were unchanged, their leader sent a man to gather herbs and plants, yerba, to wash their bodies after the loss of their brothers and sisters. The man left before sunrise, but the sun still managed to transform him into a hummingbird, which is called Guaini in Siboney Taino. The Guani man never returned, forcing the Taino leader, Guahayona, to leave Casibahagua. And when he did so, he took all of the women from the cave, as well as those in the land governed by Chief Anacacuya, or Central Star, whose name refers to the North Star and Ursa Major. When observed from the Caribbean, Ursa Major dips below the horizon between the months of April and August, marking the beginning of the hurricane season. Guahayona left the women from the 2 tribes in an unpopulated island, and he placed their children in a ravine far away. The hungry children then cried out for their mothers, yelling toa, toa, or water, water. Although Guahayona promised that the women could return to their families afterward, this never happened. He instead continued westward to the land of Guanin, which means gold-copper alloy, among other things, and he forever separated the men and women from Anacacuya's chiefdom. The children were converted into frogs, doubly marking the end of the second people of the Tainos. Whereas the first people were transformed by the sun, water serves as the primary agent of change during this second age. According to archaeologist Jose Oliver, the rain establishes the rhythm of the seasons and the new social order produced by the merging of women and men from different chiefdoms. In this second iteration of the Taino world, gold, copper metals, medicinal plants and herbs, and hurricanes emerge as critical elements of community life. These are the same details that López de Mesa mentioned in his petition, which unfolds during the third and present reign of the Taino people, those who found themselves under Spanish rule. Whereas Spanish writers placed humans, metals, and plants in separate chapters of their natural histories, Tainos considered these animate beings as part of a common taxonomy, one whose multisensory world of phenomenological unity reflects and reveals a holistic universe, according to archaeologist Nicholas J. Saunders. Throughout the Americas, many indigenous communities believe that shiny objects, places, and phenomenon radiate, quote, elements of the spiritual and creative power of light, such that golden jewelry, feather headdresses, lighting, and sunlight are all charged with cosmological power. Taínos were no exception, and they used language to reinforce these conceptual connections. As Oliver explains, among the historic Taíno, the tagua plant, which you see in the center of the screen, with its pungent smell, the guainina, Cassia occidentalis plate, with its golden smelly flower, the iridescent feathers of the Cuban guani hummingbird, the caguamo turtle, the island of Caguaini, and the gold, copper, silver alloy, guanin, form a single class of materials that are all called guanin. All of these terms share the same root morpheme, wa, and they are distinguished by their shimmering essences, or in the case of Caguani Island, the location where such shiny objects live. In other words, Taíno cosmologies yoke together organic materials based on sensory experiences of shimmering light and strong smells, such that humans, animals, plants, and metals exist within a shared category of animated life. Chiefs like Anacacuya and Guajayona therefore wore golden jewelry, radiant feathered headdresses, and pungent yellow-orange flowers in sensory-rich ceremonies, as suggested by stone and wooden objects, like this duo or ritual seat, whose shiny materials represent the body parts that mediate human experiences in the world, such as eyes, ears, and mouths. Taíno taxonomies suggest a fundamentally different way of organizing and understanding organic materials than do the Iberian or European classification systems we're used to studying. Understanding the sensory web of colors, scents, and embodied actions involved in the making and wearing of shimmering metals, which themselves were produced in seasonal cycles and with specific herbs and plants, allows for a renewed appreciation of the Taíno cosmologies that are embedded in Pedro Lopez de Mesa's petition. In other words, by putting a creation narrative in dialogue with material cultures, linguistic data, and archival documents like laws, petitions, and council members' notes and scribbles, we can see a vibrant, meaningful Taíno presence in the day-to-day practices and overarching philosophy of 16th century Caribbean goldwork. Colonial Latin Americanists are trained to work outside of disciplinary silos and with a deep methodological toolkit. And so even though it might not seem like it, our training prepares us to contribute to critical debates that are worlds away in time and space from the 16th century Caribbean. This was not something that was apparent to me until I was asked to co-chair a committee involving a racist statue at my university. The University of Virginia was founded by Thomas Jefferson in 1819, 10 years after he completed his term as the third president of the United States. UVA is, like all academic institutions in colonial and imperial spaces, steeped in the power dynamics of colonialism. Latin Americanists are used to thinking of the colonial era as an ongoing phenomenon, one felt today in the daily experiences of people in Central America, the Andes, the Caribbean, and communities throughout the global South. But the colonial period remains ongoing everywhere, and my university town is no exception. Between 1916 and 1924, in response to federally mandated programs to rebuild or reconstruct the American South after the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, the city of Charlottesville erected 4 monuments. 2 statues memorialized Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, generals of the Confederate Army, which is the side that lost the war, and 2 statues celebrated colonial settlement of what became the United States. And I've specifically chosen images of the statues being removed. There are others online, but I like these the best. The first of these statues on the left-hand side of the screen celebrated the expedition of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to the Pacific Northwest, wherein Lewis and Clark stand tall and brandish weapons, and Shoshone knowledge holder Sacagawea, without whom travel would have been impossible, crouches beneath them. The other statue on your right represented Revolutionary General George Rogers Clark, the older brother of William Clark, in his military campaigns against Native peoples. The massive bronze statue of George Rogers Clark, which for almost 100 years sat across from the Children's Hospital on West Main Street in Charlottesville, marking the transition from the city to the university, aims to depict Clark in real size. It therefore stands 24 feet high atop a pedestal declaring him conqueror of the Northwest. This life-size Clark is followed by soldiers as he charges his horse into an unarmed crowd of native people, including a tribal elder, the first figure you see on if you read the image left to right, who meets the horse's nose with his elbow, and a woman kneeling on the ground with a cradle board, presumably with a baby nestled within it. And I've indicated her with an arrow here. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources calls the statue alarmingly but not surprisingly, and apparently with zero irony, a masterful and complex work of art. In August of 2017, these statues, just 4 of the approximately 2,000 monuments to white supremacy that are located across the US and concentrated especially in the South, as you see on this map, became the epicenter of a wave of white nationalist violence that has always been part of the US story and erupted once more during the presidency of Donald Trump. In the aftermath of the violent convergence of neo-Nazis, white Christian nationalists, and far-right militia groups who vowed to protect the statues, the city and the university intensified their efforts to remove the monuments. In the summer of 2020, the university's Racial Equity Task Force completed a report on mitigating the history of systemic violence and racism at UVA. One of its top-level recommendations was to remove the George Rogers Clark statue from the campus and hire a tribal liaison to guide discussions on the disposition of the statue and the redesign of the park where it once stood. Universities, though, moved slowly and unevenly, and in February of 2021, I was asked by the president of our university to co-chair the statue removal committee with one of the authors of the task force report. In the summer of 2022, we wrote the ad for the tribal liaison, and the search is currently underway. It was not apparent to me how I was qualified to take on this work as someone with a PhD in English, a postdoc in history, and an appointment in Spanish, but we were in the thick of the pandemic, couldn't travel to archives, and did not have childcare for an 18-month-old. So I agreed to take on the heavy service role until I could return to research. But little did I know that this project would force me to actively research. Early on, the committee decided on a 2-part structure to remove the statue. Part 1 would take place as soon as possible, hide the statue from public view and stop it from doing harm to the thousands of students, faculty, staff, and community members who walk by it every day. Part 2 would be slow and deliberate, involving extensive consultation with Native nations who were affected by Clark's violent campaigns and the statue's glorification of them. Because the statue did not contain any specific or culturally specific tribal markers, I think that's the end of my slide, so I can stop my share. The committee resolved to define affected Native nations in the broadest possible terms. But this could mean all 574 federally recognized tribes in the US, since they're all affected by white supremacy, which would make it impossible to schedule meetings, let alone make decisions by consensus. So after extensive discussions, the committee decided to use a circles of impact model inherited from trauma theory. Community member Virginia Busby, an archaeologist with extensive experience in environmental compliance and tribal consultation, proposed the idea. Ring theory, which is also known as impact theory, was developed by psychologist Susan Silk and mediator Barry Goldman in recognition that a person in trauma exists within a larger interconnected set of social worlds. Some are closer to the trauma, while others are farther away. For our project, this meant that people in the first circle, those most traumatized by the statue, would have the greatest say about its outcome. They were Native students who had daily contact with the statue, and they were represented on the committee by the president of the Native American Student Union, Zach Russell, who is also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Next in this ring model were the 11 state and federally recognized Indian nations of Virginia, some of whom might have never seen the statue, but all of whom had been affected by the message it sent to Native students about their place in higher education and public life in Virginia. The third circle included any Native nation who interacted with Clark. The next challenge was to identify those nations in the third circle. And as we were in early committee meetings, one of the committee members, an expert in religious studies, figured that we could just Google it and go to Wikipedia to figure out which tribes had come into contact with Clark. That quickly became not a viable solution to make this kind of policy decision. And so, informed by this approach from trauma theory, this is where my training as a colonialist, who was used to dealing with really fragmented records, kicked in. I began with books and journal articles about Clark, and then emailed the authors of those works and the major sources they cited, authors of the major sources, asking for recommendations on additional sources, and asking who I should talk to, knowing that oral histories would be an important part of documentation, as we had seen in the Taino case, with the recording of an oral history. Once the name of a tribe appeared in a document or came up in conversation, I searched for their modern-day descendants and reached out to ask not only if they would like to participate in the process of tribal consultation about the statue, but also, and importantly, who else should be invited. This led to a rapid expansion of the list because there is not a defined chronological or geographic limit on harm, and the colonial era borders that Clark knew don't apply today. Native nations have merged, disbanded, and regrouped extensively over time, as we saw in the Taino case. In one case, Clark passed through areas of Pennsylvania that are home to the Susquehanna Nation. But in 1677, about 100 years before his campaign, the Susquehanna were absorbed into the Six Nations Confederacy in New York and Canada, meaning that I would need to write to officials of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations. Tuscarora scholar Alyssa Mount Pleasant, a historian of 18th century North America, gave me contact information for 2 cultural resource officers in the Seneca Nation. One of them answered my email with a contact list for 14 state and federally recognized tribes in their area, all of which then went on my list of tribes that needed to be invited to consult. In this way, one name in one fragmentary record, the name of the Susquehanna, led to 14 living nations being invited to the table. In other cases, colonial records use names like Potawatomi, with no way of distinguishing the living citizens of the citizen Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma from the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians in Michigan and Indiana. So we decided to invite any tribe with the name Potawatomi in their name, and we left it to them to determine if they had a stake in the conversation. Still, other cases were dead ends, like finding a map that mentioned Massawomics, a nation in pre-1607 Virginia, for whom I was unable to find any present-day descendant communities. In the end, I was able to document 67 modern living Native nations whose ancestors had been affected by Clark's campaigns. The university president then sent letters to each chief inviting them to consult on the disposition of the statue and the redesign of the park site. 13 nations decided to do so. Some chiefs participated directly, while others sent delegates. Some participants attended all 4 meetings that we held between September and December of 2021, while others chimed in asynchronously by email, phone, and survey instruments. At the end of the process, which I co-chaired with a citizen from the Monacan Nation, we prepared a report with recommendations on repairing relationships, building programs, reimagining the park, and what to do with the statue. UVA is working to enact those recommendations. We have a tribal fellow in residence, an annual speaker series in Indigenous political and social thought, a team working on scholarships for citizens of Virginia tribes, and a budget of $1.4 million to convert the park into a contemplative space to learn from history and dream about a different kind of future with art installations in various modes, but especially Indigenous futurisms. This project is not one that I thought I was qualified for, but it turns out that the research, writing, and listening skills that I've developed as a scholar and a teacher who works with fragmented colonial archives were well suited to the challenges. At least in the US, and I'll be curious to know about the UK in our Q&A, humanities scholars are not often seen as relevant to conversations about the most pressing issues of our day. But this statue project shows in a very small way, I think, that our ability to read around archival silences, from Taino gold work to tribal lands in North America, and to explain complex historical legacies in ways that are legible to policymakers and the public, are precisely the kinds of skills required to enact meaningful change and build relationships of trust with local communities. And that's where I want to end today, by inviting us to think together about what we do as Latin Americanists and how we can apply our skills to solve problems in other world regions, especially perhaps in our own homes. I look forward to hearing about your own experiences and your interests in the discussion, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Allison. That was great, very interesting, and it resonates with some of the discussions that are taking place, at least here at the University of Manchester, regarding its link with the slave trade, about which we haven't been particularly consulted, the Latin Americanists. And I think that could be an interesting distinction as well. This view that I guess is more prevalent here, that kind of the issue of slavery is something that permeates the whole issue of the African diaspora and everything else is mainly located in the US and in the English-speaking Caribbean. But I think you have given us a lot of things, interesting things to discuss. Anybody has a question? Who wants to kick off?
Yeah, I can maybe, oh, sorry, Frank, you go ahead.
Oh, if you want to go first, Pete, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, I was just wondering, I mean, one of the ways in which it's been suggested that the issue of these statues can be resolved or partially resolved. I mean, obviously resolution is a very complex issue. Anyway, one of the ways that's been suggested is to kind of contextualize them, to retain them in their locations, but to give more information about them and what they mean, and the whole sort of historical context that they exist in. And I wondered what you thought about that, whether you think that's a good way forward or not.
Thank you. Recontextualization was one of the solutions proposed, particularly for the Sacagawea statue. So that statue features the two white explorers standing vertically with their guns, and she's kind of crouched on the ground. The way that the statue, and it's placed at a traffic intersection between the two main streets in town, Main Street and Ridge McIntyre Street. And it was about 30 feet in the air. And so in the context of the traffic circle, her being crouched on the ground was read as extremely dismissive of her knowledge. But one of the museums in town suggested that if you were to put the statue on the ground and surround it by, for example, an herb garden or plants, then you could use the same physical fact of the statue to tell a story about how she's reading the landscape. So that project of recontextualization might work for that particular statue. I've seen another really good model in DC where a statue of Thomas Jefferson, sort of in the generic like pose like this, is then surrounded by the names of the 300 people he enslaved. And that is another very powerful example of how to recontextualize. The George Rogers Clark statue was almost impossible because of the physical layout, where it sat in the park, how it was surrounded by just empty space, the size of it at 24 feet, and the fact that it has him charging into a crowd of unarmed women and children. There was really just no way to make that anything other than a monument to genocide. And so the committee pretty quickly, in consultation with Native communities, decided that it just needs to be removed. And what they came up with was, what the 13 nations who participated came up with, was a redesigned park space that will have a walking path. And so there will be historical markers throughout the walking path that explain what the statue was and what was there, as a kind of recontextualization. But that historical information is then also going to be placed in dialogue with poetry by local Native artists, with examples of beadwork and multimedia design installations. So the idea is to create spaces for contemplation and reflection, but also forms of education, and to use the aesthetics to encourage people to dream about a different kind of life. I should say there's also going to be a botanical garden there that's curated by a rotating group of Native knowledge holders. And none of those things would have been possible in the space if we had kept the statue. So moving it, in this case, for this project, moving it made a lot more sense and allowed greater possibilities. But I think, to your point, there are other cases where recontextualization can make a lot of sense.
Frank?
Thanks, Ignacio. First of all, thanks, Allison, for the paper, and thanks for your work, which is absolutely fascinating. And I teach part of your book in my final year course, and students really like it. So thank you very much for that. In relation to to this particular case, I was wondering whether you have any insight as to why why the president of the university went to you rather than, say, a historian of colonial US, right? I mean, because one could in a way think that maybe people who have specific expertise on the subject area would have been the natural choice. And in a way, I think that's the situation we are facing here, right? That in Manchester, I mean, in that it is colleagues who work on British or Caribbean history who are particularly involved in these projects dealing with the university's link to the enslaved trade, right? So it'd be quite interesting to know if you have any insight as to why you were chosen for this task.
Yeah, no, it is a little bit of a mystery to me. The chair of another group on campus that was formed about a year after ours and is in charge of recontextualizing 11 statues is also a colonial Latin Americanist. It's Brian Owensby. So for whatever reason, two of us have now been tapped to have these leadership positions working in North America, which I think is really interesting. The only thing I can think of is I am the co-director of the PhD Fellowship in Indigenous Studies. So I have something of a faculty profile in the field here. And I think the author of the report, who was my co-chair for phase 1, had heard that I was a not unreasonable person to work with on committees. And so I think she had a pretty large hand in asking that I be tapped for the position. But it is kind of curious. I actually think that we do have a lot of skills that come out of Latin American studies, not just for colonialists, but I'm thinking, someone who works on the Guatemalan Civil War is going to be dealing with the same kinds of methodological challenges of how do you tell a story about trauma? How do you have access to these records? What do you do with them? I think there are a lot of cases in Latin American studies where the skills that we have as researchers and teachers are directly relevant to these projects, although we might not always be seen that way. I would be extremely curious after Yeti's question to know whether any of you think that, at Manchester, you might approach your university now and make an argument for why you should be in these conversations. But I want to give Yeti a chance to ask her question first. And thanks for the question.
Yeti, go ahead.
Hi, Allison. Wonderful to hear you speak about your work again. I had a question following on what you were saying about methodology. Thinking of the specific case, trained as a colonial Latin Americanist in the context of coming as a Latin American, with a Latin American perspective to a US issue. In terms of your work with communities, because I think that might be a point of productive difference, perhaps, thinking about how tribal affiliation is decided in the United States and the lack of, the difference that you can have between, the interpretation of things like blood quantum for proper citizenship and a sense of representation. I heard you in your talk refer often to negotiating with nations rather than with kind of communities that self-identify as indigenous. So I was wondering how you negotiated what I imagine was or can be a very tricky panorama. And the reason I asked this is because I'm sort of comparing your remarks with other recent talks of colleagues who are working on statues that are affecting descendants of enslaved Africans in other, where perhaps that ability to trace a past is part of the brutalization of colonialism on them, right? So how do you what recommendations would you have from the experience hands-on of dealing with the specificity of your case, precisely to the question that you're posing to colleagues in Manchester, but certainly well beyond, how to use a historical training so that it doesn't sound arbitrary and vague, and yet not privilege communities that can reconstruct that past more directly versus other communities that can't establish that link as clearly.
Thank you so much. So that's why a really important part of the documentation process was asking, once I found someone, I would then say, who else do I need to talk to? Like, who do you think I need to talk to? Because not all of the nations are going to be documented, right? And just because, in a lot of the cases, the names that I found in colonial sources didn't necessarily map on to present day communities, and the paths to find their descendants is not clear. And I'm sure that we still left a lot of people behind, in part because of this issue of sovereignty. The way that Indigenous citizenship or nationality is defined in the US used to be through blood quantum, which was a colonial construct in and of itself, and is now being rejected by a lot of nations. In Virginia, we're very lucky that the Native nations here reject and don't use blood quantum. They see it as a colonial tool that was designed to write them out of existence as a kind of paper genocide. But I think that is not true in other areas of the country. And I would imagine that scholars working in those areas and with those universities would have a difficult or at least a different path than what we have. So here we were lucky that sovereignty, Native sovereignty, is really understood as a government to government relationship. And so the project that went before us was UVA building a monument to the enslaved laborers of the university. And in that project, which kind of created a blueprint for us a little bit, there was a descendant community group that formed as its own independent 501c3. And so although not all of the descendants are part of that group, it at least created a model of how you work as a university administration with the recognized leadership of another group. And so for our statue project, we pretty early on said, any decisions that we make need to go through the chiefs, so that we are reaching our university president, although he's not the leader of a nation, is the leader of our group. And so correspondence needs to be formal and official and come from his letterhead and his office, and reach out chief to chief. And then once that communication is established, now I send text messages to the cultural resource officer that I work with for the Pamunkey Indian Nation, for instance. But we used really formal diplomatic protocols in the beginning as a recognition of the way that the Native nations here operate. And that's a structure that made it easy in a sense, because we had a clear line of communication, and there was one person then to make the decision about whether their nation should participate or not. I would think that in other cases, it's a lot more difficult. I'm thinking of, in Puebla, for example, all of those monuments, who gets to decide, who gets to speak about them? In some ways, the more straightforward system of governance that Native nations have established in North America makes it an easier task to deal with on a government to government, leader to leader basis. It would be interesting to see, what this kind of conversation would look like in a place like Puebla. Thanks for the question.
Allison, I have a couple of questions. So it was decided that the best thing was to remove the statue. But what are the plans for that particular monument? Secondly, if what was kind of the general, I mean, it's hard to generalize, but the response from various sectors within the university, also community members who might be involved with the university somehow, student body. I mean, I know there are different actors with different and sometimes competing interests, but maybe you can give us an overview of what reactions did you manage to identify?
So disposition. We were originally told by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources that we were not allowed to melt the statue down. We were told that in May of 2021. So we got that, understood that we couldn't transform it or change it. So we removed the statue, and then had this 4-month process of consultation with tribes to determine what to do with it. in our last meeting in December of 2021, a representative from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources said live on the call, "Oh no, you can melt it down." And everyone, I mean, we're all on Zoom, right? So everyone, you can see everyone else's face. And it's a complete reversal of what we had been told 6 months earlier. So we just took a new vote, and the tribes came up with a ranked system. The first preference, all preferences were unanimous, but this was the order. Preference number 1, transform it into something else, some other art installation that will be on the site. Preference 2, transfer the ownership of the statue into a deed held in trust with the 11 Native Nations of Virginia and the university, so that any decision going forward has to be made by consensus with all 12 parties. And preference number 3 was leave it in storage for it until we have a different political climate. So in 2021, when we did the work, we had a Democratic governor who was very sympathetic to this cause. And he was replaced in the next election by a Republican governor who campaigned in part on removing critical race theory from education. And so, and all the tribes here are working with the same governor, so they're very familiar with his worldview and the way that he likes to do things. And so they decided that we should just wait for now, keep it in storage, focus on the things that we can do, like scholarships, like reforming the park. And then once we have a different political atmosphere in Virginia, then we reapproach the question of disposition. So that's kind of where we left things. With a ranked system, right now we're doing number 3, which is acceptable to all of the parties, but is not anyone's first choice. In terms of the response, a few of the chiefs reached out directly to the president to say that they were really happy with the process. They felt like this was a really good experience. They were not used to being listened to by UVA. They appreciated that in meetings, I would often stop and check for understanding. And then, many times you could see on the call, like, I would say, okay, so what I'm hearing is this. And they would say, no, that's 100% wrong. What I'm trying to say is, and so I would type up the minutes again, and we would go through lots and lots of processes of, or lots of stages of listening sessions and revising, making sure that we had all heard and understood the same thing. And that seemed to produce a really good outcome. I will say one of my frustrations is that we gave a pretty clear list of things to do, and the university has been very slow in moving on some of those things. Like scholarships for students was one of the main priorities to emerge from consultation. And whereas UVA has dedicated a lot of money to the park space, and that's great, it's very visible, it's public, scholarships has just been very slow moving. And so the response from different wings of the university is uneven. In some areas, they move very quickly. And in other areas, we have been meeting about these things for almost 2 years with very limited progress on some of the areas. Students overall seem pretty happy with the process, and they especially appreciated that they had a seat on the committee from the very beginning. So all of because we explained to the Native Student Union that they worked the first circle. We heard from multiple officers in the student union as well, not just the student who was on the committee. So overall, people seem, tribal partners and students seem pretty happy with the process. Everyone is happy that the statue is gone. I think we wish that we had made more progress in the other areas as well. But we are hopefully having our first speaker as part of the new speaker series in February or March. So I'm just waiting for the big name person to confirm his availability. But this was a series that was decided with citizens of 2 of the tribal nations of Virginia and a member of the Native American Student Union. So we had good representation on the committee, and there's going to be a lot of community buy-in for the topic.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds quite promising, I have to say. Sounds yeah. Pete, you have another question?
Yes, this may be a very dumb question, but I mean, I was very interested in the discussion of Taino cosmology and the way they group things together, you know, on the basis of things like, you know, qualities like shininess and so on. But I sort of lost the connection between that and the whole thing about the statues. Could you go over that again, please?
Sure. And it's rushed because I was cutting and pasting from the book to try to make sure I had enough time for the statue part, which this is the first time I've talked about the statue project. So thanks for giving me an audience to try out new material. I'm having a book workshop on the statue project in February with people who participated in the tribal consultation. And then through that conversation, we're going to decide if that becomes a book or not. But my sense is it probably is going to be the next book. So the point I was trying to make about Taino cosmology is that we have this, so the quote that I gave about Tainos as a vanished people was from David Abulafala's book from 2008, which is just like one example among thousands of historians who argue that there are no Tainos anymore. And what I wanted to show was that actually there are, at the deepest levels of worldview or philosophy or cosmovision, whatever you want to call it, there is evidence of Taino thought in the day-to-day operations and the material practices, the tools and techniques and technologies of the colonial gold industry, which suggests that there was not collapse. There was a shifting and a regrouping, and that probably through patterns of storytelling, those ideas about the relationship between humans and hurricanes and plants and gold and metals find their way into Lopez de Mesa's petition. So
okay. I think I got that bit, yeah.
So we don't have great demographic data from the 1520s, but there was a survey of La Vega in 1514 through the Repartimiento that shows there were about, I think it was 80 Spaniards in the town, and then 300 native men, and then unnumbered women and children. And so if you think about what life must have been like, there were very few people for Lopez de Mesa to talk to in Spanish, and most of his world would have been Taino and Afro-Taino. And so it's not hard for me to imagine that people he was talking to would have given him stories about what they thought, how they thought the world operated, and that those stories then might appear in his proposal.
Okay,
That's what I was trying to say.
No, I understood that, but then what's the connection with the statues?
Oh, that we can trace these things even through the most fragmented colonial records. So the name of a tribe on a map that doesn't correspond to the name of any native nation today, you can, by talking to enough people and finding other sources, put them together, even when those sources are seemingly completely disjunct, like a creation narrative and a petition that has doodles on the side of it.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Catalina.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Allison, for your presentation. It was really interesting what you explained about the trauma theory, I think, and the circles of impact of trauma, and how do you use that to search for the different communities and engage with them. I was just wondering if you can explain a little bit more if the engagement and methodology change according to those circles, and if in terms of reparation to those communities, there was also a a prioritization of those reparations according to the circles, because you were also mentioning that you have some reparations, let's say the scholarships, that are not working as well as the statute. So I was wondering, is that because everyone, like every claim that you made went on the same level, or this is just because it was out of your hands, let's say?
Thank you so much, because that was, I stopped my share before I got to that slide. Let me put that up. So this is the model, and I can put the link in the chat afterwards. So it's not a perfect correspondence. The model from trauma theory is that at the center you have the person affected by the trauma, and then they are surrounded by people who give them support. And the way that this emerges is from clinical practice, where people in the circles surrounding the trauma victim are just supposed to provide care into the center, and they are instructed to share their problems and their grief and their trauma with the people who are farther away from it, so that you're never putting a burden into the center, but you're dumping out, as they call it, at the bottom. So the people who are in, close, the people who are really close, the parents, the siblings, provide care into the center, and then share their problems with, say, colleagues or people who are farther away from the trauma. Now, this doesn't work exactly for our project. So we just use the principle. So the principle was that the people who are most affected have the greatest say. So the people at the core, students who have the most contact with it, had a direct seat on the committee and got to participate in every process, every part of the process, from the design and the earliest brainstorming to the execution. Then the Virginia Indian Nations were invited by the president, not just to participate in this one project, but to have an annual summit with him and to have an open dialogue. And then the letters that we sent to those third circle, so 67 minus 11, to the 56 nations that were outside of Virginia, was an invitation to participate just in the statue project, but not, further dialogue with UVA about everything else. So that was how we adapted this idea for the project. The people who had been hurt the most and had the most contact with the harmful statue had the greatest say. We're also using a similar kind of approach for the scholarships. So one of the challenges that we have is that we're a public institution, and there are some state and federal rules that you can't give scholarships based on race. So we're trying to, Native nations are not races, they're nations, but Indigenous/Native American is a box that people check on the form for documenting race. And so one of the challenges that we have is to disentangle those two. And so for the scholarships, the proposal is the same. Because it's going to be a massive project to fundraise for scholarships for Native students, we're proposing phase 1 is just scholarships for Virginia Indian Nations. And then once we have a base of funds and we've increased the enrollments for undergraduates who are local, then we can begin to offer maybe scholarships for students regionally, and then maybe scholarships for students who aren't enrolled citizens but have Indigenous ancestry or heritage from other world regions. But we're using the same kind of circles of impact model to give priority to the students who are from here, and then over time expand out. So even though it's not a perfect correspondence, the question of reparations or remediation of harm, I think there are approaches from trauma theory that we could use. Thank you, Yari. Sorry, I'm over time.
Avijami?
Thank you very much for this very interesting and really important work. I was wondering if the outcomes and learnings of this exercise is going to be incorporated in some kind of manual that could be mobilized in international at the international level in public policy institutions at the national level and also in the grassroots level. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So the editor who did my first book, which has the material from the Taino section that I presented today, left UNC Press, which the press that did the book, and is now at UVA Press, University of Virginia. And she wants a book on the statue project. So that's why we're having this roundtable with 3 of the women who participated in tribal consultation through their nations in February. So I'll be there, they will be there, and my editor will be there, along with anyone else who wants to come. And we're going to have a discussion about whether this should be a book or not. And if it is, my sense is, it'll be a public history, so it's going to be written very differently than my first book, which if you've tried to teach it, it's like probably not very accessible as a public piece, because it emerged from a dissertation, not from something I was thinking about as a public scholar. But this statue book would have a little bit on the history of the Monacan Nation and the university and the relationship, a little bit on colonial archives and how we work with those sources, and then pretty extensive discussion of how the committee operated as a kind of how-to manual for other universities that are thinking through these questions.
Oh, that's excellent. And just very briefly, as I see, like there could be like a big potential for, I don't know, UNESCO or international courts of law, and again, like international or cross national grassroots organizations to incorporate all this knowledge as in terms of methods and repositories of strategies and so on. So besides the book and the potential possibilities it can have in terms of impact beyond academia, is there any consideration from the core group, including you or the university, to incorporate people working from these areas like public policy and grassroots, wider grassroots community, so you can get like somebody who does the work of translating it in terms of a manual or something like that?
Yeah, we had talked about, and other presidential commissions have had websites that have some of their products and their workflows. We haven't done that yet, in part because the project is ongoing, and we haven't finalized disposition. We are waiting for a different political climate. And our statue committee has succeeded very well in flying under the radar. The 2 of the other statues that I presented, the Lee and the Jackson statues, they have been held up in court processes since 2018 because they are such public pieces, whereas by being a little bit low profile and working just with the affected nations, but not with everyone in the city of Charlottesville or a wider public, we've actually been able to get more done. So I think at the end of it, once these questions of disposition and the scholarships are established, then we might, there might be some interest in doing that. Although my sense, honestly, from the partner nations is that their priorities are really things like sustainable housing, food sovereignty, scholarships for their kids. Like the statue thing is great and they're happy we did it, but they are also very ready to move on to other things that the university can help them with. So part of my job is just when I get to have FaceTime with administrators, I remind them of that. Like, hey, this is who they want to hire. Are we hiring anyone in business incubation who specializes in women and minority-owned businesses?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank once again Allison for the talk and everything we have learned. and everything that you have given us as, in terms of things to think about. And yeah, and thank you everybody for coming. It's been an adventurous talk, but hopefully we managed to have a really interesting seminar in the end. So thank you everybody. And this is our last seminar of the semester, right, Pete? Yeah, so we will circulate details. We will circulate the details of our next seminar once the second semester starts.
The next one is in February, sometime in February. I can't remember the exact date.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, especially Allison, and have a good winter break. And stay in touch.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
and
Allison.
good luck with your own projects at the university.
Thank you.
Keep posted.
Okay, bye.
Bye.